I found out about my nephew's birthday party the way strangers did. Through photos. I was sitting on my couch, laptop open, half distracted by job listings, when my sister's smiling face appeared on my screen. Balloons in the background. A dinosaur-themed cake. My nephew wearing the paper crown I'd bought him the year before. I scrolled slowly. There was my mother laughing. My father holding a gift. Cousins I hadn't seen in months. The caption read, "Perfect day with immediate family." Immediate family. I stared at the words longer than I meant to. 2 weeks earlier I had asked my parents about the party. My mother had waved it off. "Oh, it's just something small," she said. "Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it." I clicked through the photos again, looking for a misunderstanding. Maybe it had been last minute. Maybe they forgot. Then I saw my sister's reply to a comment beneath one of the pictures. Wanted to keep it simple this year. Didn't want it to be awkward with her situation. Her situation. I remember feeling something shift, not anger, not yet. Something quieter. They hadn't forgotten me. They had edited me out. I didn't realize then how important that silence would become. When people hear the word unemployed, they imagine instability. I wasn't unstable. I had been a senior operations director at a mid-sized logistics firm for 6 years. I managed regional teams, negotiated vendor contracts, and handled budgets larger than most people's mortgages combined. My performance reviews were steady. My bonuses consistent. The restructuring came fast and impersonal. A merger. A new executive team. A spreadsheet of redundancies. My position was eliminated in a meeting that lasted 12 minutes. "It's not performance-based," HR repeated twice. I believed them. I left with severance references and a quiet ache I didn't fully acknowledge at first. I had savings. I had investments. I had a plan. I did not have panic. In the months that followed, I adjusted my routine rather than collapsing under it. I updated my resume. I scheduled interviews. I networked discreetly. I tracked expenses carefully, not out of fear but out of habit. I woke up at the same time every morning. I exercised. I cooked dinner instead of ordering takeout. I read industry reports while others might have scrolled endlessly. Losing a job shifts your identity temporarily, but it doesn't erase your competence. At least it shouldn't. My family, however, has always equated titles with worth. When I received my promotion to director years earlier, my father had introduced me at gatherings as our executive daughter. When I lost that title, the descriptor evaporated. Now I was simply between things. Between things sounds polite. It also sounds fragile. What they didn't see was the steadiness beneath it. The fact that my emergency fund covered 18 months comfortably. That I had no debt. That I had turned down 2 rushed offers because they didn't align with where I wanted to lead. I wasn't spiraling. I was recalibrating. But recalibration is invisible. And invisibility in my family has always been misinterpreted. In my family, achievement was currency. Not affection exactly. Affection was present in small practical Washam-cooked meals, birthday cards, rides to the airport. But admiration, the kind that lifted your name in a room, was earned through performance. When I brought home straight A's in high school, my father taped the report card to the refrigerator. When I made varsity soccer, my mother called relatives overseas. Success was visible, measurable, repeatable. Failure or even pause was treated like static on a clear signal. "You're capable of more," my father would say whenever I slipped slightly below expectation. Capable meant productive. Productive meant worthy. My sister's children became the next recipients of that energy. My nephew's milestones were tracked with enthusiasm. First words. First steps. First place in a spelling bee. Our family thrives on upward motion. When I earned my first executive role, the pride was immediate. My parents told neighbors. They updated holiday letters. My title became shorthand for my value. "This is our daughter, the director," my mother would say, as if the word itself carried proof of good parenting. I won't pretend I didn't enjoy it. Back then I equated approval with belonging. If I worked hard enough, climbed high enough, there would be no doubt about my place at the table. Then and now feel different when I replay them. Then I measured myself through their reactions. Promotion meant affirmation. A bonus meant reassurance. I chased growth partly because I loved the work and partly because it silenced comparison. Now I understand something I didn't then. Respect built on performance is conditional. It fluctuates. When the restructuring happened and my title dissolved, I noticed the shift almost immediately. Conversations grew cautious. My parents stopped asking about strategy meetings and started asking whether I had heard anything back yet. Yet, my mother began introducing me differently. "This is our daughter," she'd say, followed by a small pause that hadn't been there before. "She's taking some time to figure out her next step." Taking time. It sounded voluntary. It wasn't. At family dinners, career updates were still the main event. My cousin's law firm partnership. My brother-in-law's promotion. My sister's husband's new client acquisition. When the conversation circled to me, it softened. "So, any interviews?" my aunt would ask gently. Gentle questions can feel sharper than direct ones. I would answer calmly. "Yes, I'm exploring opportunities. Yes, I'm being selective." But I could feel the recalibration happening beneath the surface. My status had shifted, and with it the energy directed toward me. Achievement-based admiration has a subtle edge. It makes you valuable while you're rising and precarious when you're pausing. I didn't resent my family for caring about success. I had grown up in that system. I understood it. What unsettled me was how quickly absence of title translated into diminished presence. When I wasn't performing visibly, I was no longer central. That should have been my first clue. Approval that rises with status will fall just as quickly when status changes. The night I scrolled through those birthday photos, the absence felt heavier than the unemployment itself. I wasn't excluded because I had failed. I was excluded because I was in transition. And in my family, transition looks too much like weakness. Back then I would have scrambled to restore the old image. Accepted the first offer that came through. Rebuilt my title so admiration could return. Now I held something steadier. Self-definition. I knew who I was without a job title. The problem wasn't my stability. It was their metric. I didn't call my sister first. I called my mother. I waited until the next afternoon when I knew my father would be home from his errands, and they would both be in the kitchen. I didn't want fragments of the conversation later. I wanted clarity. "Mom," I said evenly. "I saw the pictures from the party." There was a pause. Not long. Just long enough. "Oh," she replied. "It was very small. Small enough that I couldn't be there?" Another pause. "We didn't want it to feel awkward," she said carefully. "Awkward? With my situation?" I asked. She exhaled softly. "You know how people are. They ask questions." "What kind of questions?" "About work. About what you're doing next." It would have put you on the spot. On the spot. I leaned back against my kitchen counter, letting the words settle. "I can answer questions," I said. "I know," she replied quickly. "But we didn't want you to feel uncomfortable." The framing was gentle. Protective even. But something underneath it felt sharper. "Or did you not want to feel uncomfortable?" I asked quietly. Silence again. "We're just trying to keep things simple," she said finally. It was supposed to be a happy day. As if my presence would have complicated happiness. As if unemployment were contagious. I could hear my father in the background. "Tell her it wasn't personal," he said, not realizing I could hear him. "It wasn't personal," my mother repeated. "But exclusion is always personal." "You could have let me decide whether it was awkward," I said calmly. "We thought this was best," she replied. "Best for whom?" The conversation ended politely. No raised voices. No dramatic accusations. But the tension lingered after I hung up. They hadn't forgotten to invite me. They had calculated. The word awkward kept echoing in my mind. Awkward means deviation from expectation. In their view, I had deviated. My title had evaporated. My trajectory had paused. My story didn't fit neatly into celebratory small talk. I remembered something my mother once said years ago when a distant cousin lost her job. "It's hard when people stagnate," she had whispered after hanging up the phone. Stagnate. That should have been my second clue. Unemployment in my family's vocabulary was not a neutral transition. It was reputational risk. And now I understood. They hadn't protected me from questions. They had protected themselves from association. It didn't take long for the story to solidify. Within days, relatives who rarely called suddenly felt compelled to check in. "How are you holding up?" my aunt asked, her voice softened into something almost clinical. "I'm fine," I replied. "That's good," she said quickly. You know, sometimes these things happen for a reason. These things. As if restructuring were a character flaw. At the grocery store, I ran into a family friend who smiled too brightly. "I heard you're taking some time off," she said. "Must be nice." Nice. The word carried a faint edge of condescension. "I'm interviewing," I clarified. "Oh, of course," she replied. "Well, anything is better than sitting idle." Idle. The narrative was expanding without me. At Sunday lunch the following week, my cousin leaned across the table. "Have you thought about consulting?" he asked. "It's easier to get into when you've lost momentum." Lost momentum. I noticed the phrasing. Another relative suggested I could always teach. The implication being that stepping down a level would be graceful, even expected. No one said I had failed. They simply began offering alternatives to a ceiling I hadn't acknowledged. What unsettled me most wasn't the advice itself. It was the shift in tone. Conversations that once centered around my strategy meetings and leadership decisions now hovered around safety nets and contingency plans. "Do you have enough saved?" my uncle asked quietly at one gathering. "Yes," I said evenly. "Good. You never know how long these spells last." Spells. As if unemployment were an illness. I began noticing how often pity disguised itself as support. "You're still young," someone told me. "You'll bounce back." Bounce back from what? I hadn't fallen. At a family barbecue, my sister's husband introduced me to a friend as between executive roles right now. Right now. The qualifier mattered. I remember thinking that if I corrected every subtle downgrade I would exhaust myself. So I didn't correct them. I observed. Social pressure doesn't arrive as confrontation. It accumulates in comments that sound helpful but carry hierarchy. "You were always the ambitious one," my aunt said at one point, as if that trait required revision. Always. Was ambition suddenly misplaced? The most telling moment came when my mother suggested gently that I might lower expectations for my next role. "Just to get back in the game," she said. Back in the game. As if I had been benched. I realized then that in their eyes my worth was in suspension until a new title reinstated it. That should have been my third clue. They weren't concerned about my stability. They were concerned about optics. At another dinner, a relative joked lightly, "At least you have more time to reflect now." The table laughed softly. I smiled. Reflection in their minds was a substitute for influence. Each comment was small. None of them would stand alone as humiliation. But stacked together they built a quiet narrative. Unemployed meant diminished. Transitional meant fragile. Between roles meant between identities. What none of them understood was that I wasn't spiraling privately. I was rebuilding deliberately. The pity would have been easier to tolerate if it came with respect. Instead, it came with subtle recalibration. When I entered rooms now, I felt the shift in energy. Less deference. More advice. It wasn't malicious. It was conditional. And the more they adjusted their perception of me, the more determined I became not to rush into something simply to restore it. If my value required constant public validation, then it wasn't value. It was performance. What happened next would force them to confront that distinction. I didn't go looking for it. That's the part one replayed in my mind later. I was at my parents' house helping my mother update her phone software. She handed it to me casually, screen unlocked, and went to refill her tea. A notification banner slid down from the top before I could stop it. Family Circle 8. I wasn't part of that group chat. The preview read, "I just think we should give her space until she stabilizes." Stabilizes. My thumb hovered. For a second I told myself to ignore it. Close the screen. Hand the phone back. Instead I tapped. The thread opened mid-conversation. "She's been under a lot of pressure. I'm worried she's not handling it well. We don't need that energy at events." Energy. Another message followed from my sister. "She's in a downward spiral even if she won't admit it." Downward spiral. I read the words twice, scanning for context that might soften them. There wasn't any. My aunt had written, "Maybe it's better if we keep things small until she finds her footing." Finds her footing. As if I were unstable on a ledge. My father's message was shorter. "We just need to protect her pride." Protect her pride. The irony settled heavily. They weren't protecting me. They were managing optics. I stood in the kitchen holding my mother's phone, the hum of the refrigerator suddenly louder than before. That was the moment I realized unemployment had become identity, not a temporary circumstance. An identity they were organizing around. My absence from the birthday party wasn't a one-off decision. It was strategy. Distance until she stabilizes. As if I were volatile. As if the mere presence of my transitional phase could destabilize a celebration. I scrolled up further. She won't take advice, one message read. She's always been stubborn, another replied. Stubborn. That old word resurfaced again. What they saw as stubbornness was simply my refusal to narrate panic. They mistook composure for denial. I set the phone down carefully on the counter just as my mother returned. You're all set, I said evenly. My voice didn't tremble. Inside something rearranged itself. I wasn't embarrassed. I was clear. They had already rewritten me. And now I understood the script. The silence I had absorbed for weeks wasn't protective. It was editorial. They were editing me out of events until my resume caught up. For the first time since the layoff, I felt something sharper than disappointment. Resolve. I didn't confront anyone about the group chat. Not my sister. Not my parents. For years I had learned that emotional reactions in my family were reframed as instability. If I walked into that kitchen with anger, it would confirm their narrative. So I did what I've always done when things don't align. I focused on structure. I tightened my interview schedule. I stopped entertaining offers that felt safe but small. I reached out to a former mentor who had transitioned into executive leadership consulting and booked a series of coaching sessions. If you're going to re-enter, she told me during our first call, do it intentionally, not defensively. That sentence stayed with me. Not defensively. I refined my pitch. Not as someone recovering from a setback, but as someone who had led teams through operational transformation. I updated my board-facing presentation deck. I practiced articulating my vision without apology. I also declined 2 roles that would have restored my title quickly, but limited my scope. They would have stabilized perception. They would not have elevated reality. 3 months after the birthday party, I interviewed with a scaling logistics firm backed by private equity. They were searching for a CEO who understood compliance risk and operational integrity. What happened next changed everything. The offer came after the 3rd round. It wasn't just executive. It was transformative. Full operational authority. Equity stake. Board visibility. I didn't post about it. I didn't call extended family. I signed the contract quietly at my dining table. The irony didn't escape me. While they were discussing my stabilization, I was stepping into expansion. Emotional restraint replaced the urge to correct them. There would be time for clarity. Just not through argument. The invitation came through text. Family dinner next Saturday, my mother wrote. Everyone will be there. It's been a while. No mention of my absence at the birthday party. No acknowledgement of the silence that followed. Just reintegration. I stared at the message longer than necessary. I could almost hear the unspoken tone beneath it. Things have settled. It's safe now. Safe. As if I had been unstable before. I responded simply. I'll be there. By then I had been in the CEO role for 6 weeks. My first board meeting had concluded successfully. We were negotiating a regional acquisition. My calendar was full in a way that felt expansive, not desperate. But I hadn't updated my family. I hadn't needed to. Saturday arrived with its usual choreography, me mother arranging dishes, my father adjusting chairs, cousins arriving with wine and commentary. When I walked in, the energy felt cautiously warm. Polite. Measured. How are you doing? My aunt asked immediately. Better. My cousin added gently. Better. As if they expected visible fragility. I'm good, I replied evenly. My sister hugged me longer than usual. We're glad you're coming around more, she said softly. Coming around. The phrasing suggested recovery. I could feel its collective assumption that time had softened my situation. That perhaps I had accepted something smaller, more manageable. That stabilization had occurred. The social stakes were higher this time. More relatives. A few family friends. The same people who had quietly withdrawn when my title dissolved. Conversation circled predictably around promotions and business updates, just not mine. Not yet. I waited. Because sometimes the most powerful reveal is the one delivered without urgency. And I knew this moment would matter. It happened between courses. My cousin was describing his new management role, and my father was asking detailed questions about revenue targets. The conversation flowed the way it always had, achievement layered over achievement. Then my aunt turned to me. "So," she said gently, "have you figured out your next step yet?" The table quieted slightly. Not dramatically. Just enough. I set my fork down carefully. "Yes," I said. Several heads tilted in polite interest. "I accepted a CEO position last month." The silence that followed was not awkward. It was recalibrating. My father blinked once. "A CEO?" "Yes," I replied evenly. "I joined a scaling logistics firm. Private equity backed. We finalized our first acquisition this week." Acquisition. The word landed heavier than I expected. My cousin leaned forward. "Wait, what kind of acquisition?" "A regional competitor," I said calmly. "We're integrating their operations over the next quarter." I kept my tone measured. No performance. No emphasis. Across the table, my sister's expression shifted from mild curiosity to startled recognition. "You didn't mention that," she said softly. "There wasn't a reason to," I replied. My aunt cleared her throat. "That's impressive." Impressive. The word felt familiar again. My father straightened in his chair. "What's the company's name?" I told him. He nodded slowly, clearly running the information through his mental database of credibility. "That's a serious firm." "It is," I agreed. Conversation pivoted almost immediately. "How large is the team? What's your equity stake? Did they approach you or did you apply?" Questions that had been absent for months returned effortlessly. I answered each one calmly without exaggeration. The narrative flipped without confrontation. There was no apology for excluding me from the birthday party. No admission about the group chat. But I could feel the shift. The energy directed toward me was no longer softened pity. It was sharpened attention. Emily reached for her glass, her eyes lingering on me. "You must have been interviewing this whole time," she said. "Yes. And you didn't say anything." "I was rebuilding," I replied. The word hung in the air. Rebuilding, not stabilizing. My father leaned back, visibly recalculating. "We didn't realize." I didn't press him to finish. Because this wasn't about correction. It was about contrast. For months, unemployment had been framed as identity. A downward spiral. A situation requiring distance. Now, without raising my voice or revisiting the humiliation, I had re-entered the same room with undeniable clarity. Not because I needed their validation, but because their metric had been exposed. What they mistook for instability had been incubation, and what they mistook for decline had been preparation. The silence that followed wasn't dismissive. It was respectful. And that was enough. I waited until the conversation softened again before speaking. "I want to say something," I said calmly. The table stilled, not in tension this time but in attention. "When I wasn't working, I wasn't broken," I continued. "I was transitioning." No one interrupted. "My employment status didn't change who I was," I said. "It changed how I was perceived." I let that settle. "I understand that you didn't want awkward questions at the birthday party," I added gently. "But being excluded because I didn't have a title, that's not protection. That's conditional belonging." My sister looked down at her hands. "I won't measure myself by invitations," I said. "And I won't accept being included only when my resume feels impressive." My tone didn't rise. "I value family," I finished. "But not at the cost of pretending worth fluctuates with employment." The room was quiet but not resistant. For once, the clarity didn't need defending. The shift wasn't loud. No one stood up to apologize. There were no dramatic embraces or confessions about the group chat. Instead, tone changed. The next morning, my father sent a brief text. "Proud of you." We didn't see the full picture. It wasn't an apology, but it was acknowledgement. My mother began asking about board meetings the way she once asked about promotions. Not out of status admiration but with genuine curiosity. "How do you handle acquisition risk?" she asked one afternoon, and for the first time in months it felt like a conversation rather than an assessment. Extended family adjusted quickly. The cousin who had suggested I lower my expectations forwarded an article about supply chain innovation and wrote, "Thought you'd appreciate this." My aunt stopped offering backup plan suggestions. Instead, she asked, "How do you stay grounded in that kind of pressure?" Grounded. The word felt different now. Emily approached things more cautiously. We didn't rehash the birthday party directly, but one evening she said, "I shouldn't have assumed you couldn't handle questions." I nodded. "You don't have to protect me from conversations," I replied. She understood the subtext. The most meaningful shift came from my nephew. A week after the dinner, he asked if I could visit. When I arrived, he ran toward me without hesitation. "Why didn't you come to my party?" he asked bluntly. Children don't soften questions. "I was busy," I said honestly. "But I'm here now." He accepted that answer, easily pulling me toward his new toy train set. There was no awkwardness in him. No recalibration of status. Just presence. I realized then that maintaining boundaries doesn't require bitterness. It requires consistency. I continued showing up when I chose to. I declined invitations when I needed space. I didn't rush to attend every gathering to prove stability. Respect once recalibrated didn't need constant reinforcement. They no longer treated my career as fragile or my absence as contagion. And I no longer shaped my availability around proving worth. The dynamic hadn't transformed into perfection, but it had shifted from conditional to conscious. And that felt like equilibrium. Unemployment was never the story. It was the space between chapters. For a while I let other people define that space for me. I let their discomfort shape the narrative. Their assumptions softened my presence in rooms where I had once stood confidently. But losing a title didn't mean losing direction. It meant pausing long enough to choose the next one deliberately. What I learned is simple and difficult at the same time. When your worth is tied to performance, every transition feels like decline. When your worth is internal, transition becomes recalibration. I wasn't in a downward spiral. I was in preparation. And the silence that once felt like exclusion became clarity. Titles come and go. Markets shift. Companies restructure. But value doesn't evaporate because a business card changes. The day I stopped defending my unemployment was the day I stopped letting it define me. My position changed. My worth did not. And no invitation will ever determine that again.